I'm Eleanor Hayes, 62 years old, a former war photographer who once believed she had seen every kind of tragedy a lens could capture. I was wrong. Nothing I photographed overseas ever prepared me for the day I buried my husband. It was raining that morning. The kind of cold, needling rain that makes every sound sharper. The umbrellas looked like black bruises scattered across the cemetery. People spoke in low voices, and the priest's words kept slipping away in the wind. While he read the eulogy, I tried to focus on the coffin in front of me, on the way the flowers trembled with each drop of rain. Then, out of nowhere, a woman stepped out from the crowd. She was younger than me, mid-30s maybe, her dark hair plastered to her face. Her shoes sank slightly into the wet ground as she walked straight toward me. She didn't look at the coffin, she looked only at me. "Mrs. Hayes?" she said, her voice trembling. She held out a small brown envelope. Before I could answer, she pressed it into my hands. "I think you should see this." The paper was soft from the rain. I opened it carefully, thinking it might be a letter of condolence. It wasn't. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, grainy, old, but unmistakable. Richard was standing in it, wearing the same gray suit he'd worn on our wedding day. His arm was around another woman, also dressed in white. The church doors behind them were identical to the ones in our wedding photos. For a second, my mind refused to understand what I was seeing. Maybe it was an old friend, a relative, a mistake. But then I saw the date written in his handwriting along the bottom edge. September 12, 1983, our wedding day. And beneath it, one more line, faint but clear through the smudged ink. "For my real bride." My fingers went cold. The photograph slipped and hit the ground face up, the rain washing over it. Someone nearby gasped, but I couldn't move. I could only stare at the image spreading into blur, the faces dissolving underwater. In my head, I heard the familiar click of a camera shutter, the sound I'd lived with my whole career. Only this time, it wasn't capturing truth. It was erasing it. The priest stopped speaking. The crowd turned toward me. I felt every gaze like a flash going off. My heartbeat drummed against my ribs. Fast, mechanical, deafening. I crouched to pick up the photo. The mud had already stained the edges. I wiped it with my sleeve, but the words stayed there, cutting through the paper like a wound. I had spent 40 years learning to read stories in people's eyes, to find meaning in a frame. Yet here was a story I couldn't explain. My own life, exposed as someone else's composition. The woman who handed me the envelope stood a few feet away, crying quietly. I didn't ask who she was. I didn't have to. Somewhere deep down, I already knew. Richard had always hated being photographed. He used to say, "You capture everyone else, Ellie, let me stay behind the lens." I thought it was humility. Maybe it was hiding. The wind picked up, scattering the priest's notes, bending the umbrellas sideways. The world looked like an overexposed negative, too bright, too harsh. Someone touched my shoulder and whispered, "Eleanor, are you okay?" I couldn't answer. My mouth moved, but no words came out. All I could think was how heavy my wedding ring felt, as if it belonged to someone else's hand. I wanted to tear the photo apart, to throw it into the wet grass and walk away. Instead, I slid it back into the envelope and held it tight against my chest, as if I needed proof that what I'd just seen was real. The priest resumed reading. The rain softened. But I heard nothing, not the prayers, not the thunder, not even the sound of people weeping. Just the faint echo of that camera click inside my head, capturing a moment that would never stop developing. People would later call me a widow. But standing there, drenched and hollow, I knew better. I wasn't the widow of Richard Hayes. I was just an extra in the photograph of his life. I met Richard Hayes when I was 28, on assignment in Bosnia. He was a military doctor stationed near Sarajevo. Calm, meticulous, the kind of man who seemed untouched by chaos. I was covering the war for a photography agency in London, chasing stories that never felt like mine. The first time I saw him, he was crouched beside a wounded boy, his hands steady even as shells fell somewhere in the distance. I remember thinking, this is what safety looks like. He noticed my camera before he noticed me. "Do you ever put that thing down?" he asked. Only when I sleep, I said. He smiled, small, knowing. Then you must dream in black and white. It was such a quiet line, but I carried it for years. After the war ended, I followed him back to the States. I told everyone it was time to stop chasing conflict, but truthfully, I just wanted to be near the one person who made me feel still. I left my job, my press credentials, and most of my savings. We settled in Portland, Oregon, and opened a small rehabilitation clinic. He was the face of it. I handled the fundraising and photography for marketing. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like rebuilding instead of surviving. In those early years, our life felt like a roll of film just beginning to develop, fuzzy around the edges, but full of promise. We lived in a narrow house with a western-facing window that caught every sunset. The first evening we moved in, I said to him, "If anyone ever betrays me, I just want to see their shadow cross the light first." He laughed, thought it was another one of my dramatic photographer metaphors. Maybe it was. But that window became everything to me. Every night, the orange light would pour through, touching the frames on our wall. The wedding photo, the clinic's first group shot, a blurry picture of us holding hands at the coast. On my desk sat the silver Leica he gave me as a wedding gift. A camera that lasts longer than promises. He'd joked. I kept it polished, the lens spotless, as if clarity could keep things from falling apart. I used to clean it every evening before bed, a small ritual that made me feel anchored. Sometimes he'd tease, "You love that camera more than me." And I'd answer, "At least it tells the truth." He would laugh, kiss the top of my head, and go back to reading his medical journals. It was an ordinary life, one I thought I had earned. Years later, things began to shift so slowly, I almost didn't notice. He started traveling more, medical conferences, humanitarian trips, guest lectures. I stayed behind, managing the clinic and pretending not to count the days. He always called. He always sent flowers. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, even the date of my first exhibition. "Ellie," he'd say on the phone, his voice soft through static, "you are the only light I have left." I used to melt when he said that. Now, when I replay those words, I wonder how many rooms that same light reached. He had a habit of leaving notes tucked into my camera bag. Tiny slips of paper folded twice, with simple lines like, "Take care of yourself," or "Don't forget to eat." It's strange how tenderness can look identical to guilt when you look back at it. There was one note I found after he returned from a trip to Seattle. It said, "I wish I could photograph what I see when I look at you." I taped it above my workspace for years. When the betrayal came, I tore it down, but the tape mark still faintly stains the wood. Looking back, there were clues. Small inconsistencies in his stories. The way he avoided being photographed. The way he'd pull away whenever I raised the Leica. He once told me, "You should only capture what's alive, Ellie. Leave the dead things alone." At the time, I thought he meant the war, how we'd both seen too much. Now I think he meant himself. Still, I never doubted him. Love, when it's familiar, blinds you in a quiet way. You stop checking focus. You assume the picture's still sharp. The last few years were routine. He'd leave for weeks at a time. I'd fill my evenings teaching part-time at a community college, photojournalism, ethics, storytelling. My students were mostly young women who thought art could save the world. I didn't have the heart to tell them that sometimes it just saves you for a little while. Every time he returned, I'd feel that cautious relief, like waiting for a photo to develop in the darkroom and finally seeing an image appear. He'd come through the door, smell faintly of airports and antiseptic, and kiss my cheek as if nothing had ever been missing. And I'd believe him. We had a tradition. Every Sunday morning, I made him coffee, black with 1 spoon of sugar, and he'd sit by the western window reading the paper. The light would fall on his face exactly the way I wanted it to when I used to take portraits. Sometimes I'd lift the camera and frame him quietly through the viewfinder. He'd sense it, lower the newspaper and say, "Don't waste film on me. Photograph something beautiful." That was his joke, but it was also a wall. He didn't want to exist inside my frame anymore. And I, fool that I was, took it as modesty. There's one afternoon I can't forget. He was packing for another trip. I asked, "Where this time?" "Chicago," he said, "a medical conference." I reached for my camera, instinctively wanting a snapshot. He waved his hand, smiling. "Come on, Ellie, don't. I look terrible." He kissed my forehead and left. The door clicked shut, and I remember the strange echo that followed. It wasn't the sound of absence. It was the sound of something already gone. That evening, I sat alone by the window and watched the sunset hit the glass. The reflection showed me holding the Leica, but for a split second, the angle made it look like there were two of me, one clear, one fading. Maybe that's how it always was between us. One of us in focus, the other disappearing just outside the frame. For a long time, I believed that loyalty was about patience, about waiting for someone to come home and pretending not to notice the gaps in their stories. I told myself that love doesn't need evidence, only faith. But faith without truth is just exposure without focus. Everything bleeds into everything else until you can't tell what's real. If you asked me then, I would have said we were happy. If you ask me now, I'd say we were well lit. There's a difference. I kept every bouquet he sent, dried between the pages of my photo albums. I thought of it as archiving affection. Now, when I open those albums, the flowers crumble, leaving dust on the photographs. Tiny brown confessions scattered across glossy paper. He died suddenly. Heart failure on a trip I didn't even know he was taking. They called me from the hospital. I remember staring at the phone, thinking of that western window, the way light had always found him even when he wasn't looking for it. After the funeral, when the woman handed me that photo, I realized the cruel symmetry of it all. The man who'd spent his life avoiding my lens had finally left me the one picture that destroyed everything. Back then, I thought his line, "You are the only light I have left," was romantic. Now, I know light travels. It never stays with one person for long. Maybe that was his truth. I still remember the morning we got married. It rained that day too. Not a drizzle, but a full spring downpour that soaked through my veil and turned the church steps into mirrors. I was 28, nervous, trying not to slip in my borrowed heels. When I did, Richard caught my hand before I hit the ground. He laughed, rain dripping from his hair, and said, "I'll never let you fall, Ellie." Not once. It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like a vow inside the vow. The photographer complained about the light, said everything looked gray and lifeless. But when the prince came back, there was one picture that stood out. The two of us standing under the church archway, my bouquet tilted, his arm around me, the sky heavy and silver. The image was slightly blurred. You could almost see the rain moving. My hair stuck to my cheek, his glasses fogged. And yet my eyes were bright, as if they'd caught the one clear ray of light that morning. I kept that photograph in my wallet for 30 years. It followed me through every move, every house, every waiting room. The edges curled, the surface scratched from being handled too much. Whenever I missed him, I'd trace my thumb over that blurred outline of his face. Sometimes, when the clinic got too loud or the news too bleak, I'd take it out just to remind myself that love could survive imperfect conditions. That beauty didn't need perfect focus. Funny how we use the wrong things to convince ourselves we're safe. The last time I looked at that photo was the night before his funeral. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same one we'd eaten breakfast at for decades. The rain had started again, tapping on the window the way it used to on our wedding day. I took the picture from my wallet and studied it under the yellow kitchen light. The paper had faded to a softer gray. My dress looked more ivory now than white. But his smile, that faint, easy smile, hadn't changed. I remember whispering, "You kept your promise, didn't you? Could never let me fall." I meant it then. I still believed it. And then, the next morning, at the cemetery, that other photograph appeared. Same church, same suit, same angle. Even the light was the same, that dull, forgiving rain. Only the woman beside him wasn't me. Two images, two brides, one man. One promise kept only long enough for the shutter to close. When I held the Polaroid at the funeral, my first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. The kind that comes when your mind tries to merge two exposures into one and realizes they'll never align. I thought of that first picture in my wallet and how the negatives must have sat side by side once, maybe even in the same drawer. Two versions of happiness developed from the same roll of film. That's what betrayal feels like to a photographer. Not fire or rage, but a distortion in the frame. A ghost image you can't erase. Sometimes, I catch myself wondering about the photographer who took that other picture. Did he see the difference? Did he know that somewhere, another bride was standing in the same rain, believing the same promise? Maybe that's why I still can't throw my old wedding photo away. It's proof of a moment that was real, at least to one of us. It's also a reminder that even the clearest image can lie. Every scar, every secret, every betrayal, they all begin as light. About 2 years before Richard died, I started to notice something strange. He no longer wanted to be in photographs. For most of our marriage, he'd tolerated my habit of documenting everything. The dinners, the road trips, the quiet Sunday mornings when sunlight hit the coffee cups just right. But lately, whenever I raised the camera, he'd lift a hand, half smiling, as if to block the lens without making it a fight. "Come on," I'd tease him. "Just one." He'd chuckle, a polite sound with no warmth behind it. "You should only photograph what's still alive, Ellie." I laughed then, thinking he was being morbid or self-deprecating about getting older. Now, I know he meant something else. At the time, I told myself he was just tired of how he looked, his hair thinner, his shoulders stooping from long hours at the clinic. I even stopped taking pictures for a while, out of respect. It didn't feel like a big sacrifice. After all, we already had decades of images. But looking back, that silence in the photo albums, the gap where his face should have been, wasn't modesty. It was evidence. He began keeping his phone close even at home. If it buzzed, he'd glance at it quickly, then turn it face down. I noticed it, of course, but marriage teaches you which curiosities to kill before they become confrontations. There were business trips that grew longer. New projects that didn't quite fit his schedule. He'd mention them casually, while buttoning his shirt or searching for his keys. I'd nod, offer to pack his suitcase, and pretend the rhythm of our life hadn't changed. Once, I asked if I could tag along to a medical conference in Seattle. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he said, too softly, "It's not really for spouses, Ellie." Long hours. You'd be bored. I remember the way he avoided my eyes as he spoke, pretending to check the clock, to tighten his tie. He wasn't lying like a coward. He was lying like someone practiced. And still, I believed him. That year, I hosted a small photography exhibit downtown, portraits of patients who had recovered from trauma. Richard was supposed to come for the opening night. He sent flowers instead. The card read, "So proud of you. Always watching the light." At the time, I thought it was beautiful. Now, the words make my skin crawl. He wasn't watching the light. He was hiding in it. There was one afternoon that still plays in my mind. He'd come home early from a trip, suitcase barely scuffed, the smell of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his collar. I noticed, of course, but he started talking about the clinic before I could ask anything. An emergency case, a young soldier with a shattered knee. He was so calm, so convincing, that I ended up apologizing for doubting him. It's funny, the tricks love plays on logic. He poured himself a drink, leaned against the kitchen counter, and looked at me with that half smile I used to find reassuring. "You always see too much through that camera of yours," he said. "Maybe sometimes, Ellie, it's kinder not to look." I smiled back, not realizing he was already teaching me how to go blind. I didn't know who she was then, the woman from that Polaroid. But I do remember a single call that winter, a wrong number, or so I thought. A soft female voice asked for Dr. Hayes. When I said he wasn't home, there was silence on the other end. Then a faint, trembling, "Thank you," before the line went dead. I never told him about it. I didn't even ask. I just hung up, washed the dishes, and told myself it was nothing. Maybe part of me already knew. Maybe the camera wasn't the only one afraid to focus. Now, when I think of his words, "You should only photograph what's still alive," I finally understand. He wasn't afraid of aging. He was afraid that one click of my shutter would capture the truth he'd buried. A second life, a second bride, a second set of vows whispered under the same gray sky. And the cruelest part? That truth waited patiently, developing in the dark, until the day they laid him in his coffin, and she appeared, holding the picture that proved it. The night after the funeral, the house felt heavier than it ever had. Rain still whispered against the windows, same as it had that morning, but now it sounded more like static than comfort. The air smelled faintly of lilies and damp wool, remnants of sympathy that didn't belong here. I turned on the hallway light and stared at the walls. They were covered in photographs, our entire life, printed, framed, and hung with careful precision. There we were, smiling on the Oregon coast, celebrating clinic anniversaries, posing with friends long gone. But the longer I looked, the more the smiles blurred. Each frame felt like a lie I'd accidentally curated. One by one, I took them down. The sound of glass against the floor was oddly soothing. Not violent, just final. By midnight, only one thing remained on the wall, my silver Leica, hanging from its old leather strap. Richard had given it to me as a wedding gift. I used to think of it as proof that he saw me, that he believed in my eye for truth. Now it felt like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was living. I took it down and turned it over in my hands. The leather was worn smooth from years of use. I flicked open the back out of habit and froze. Inside was a half-used roll of film. For a second, I didn't understand. I hadn't shot anything on that camera in months, maybe longer. My stomach tightened. I developed it myself, in the dark room behind the kitchen. The same one where we used to spend late nights laughing, waiting for images to appear in the red light. The chemicals smelled sharp, like vinegar and metal. I slipped the film into the developer, watching the shapes emerge slowly, frame by frame. At first, it was the usual: our clinic, a landscape, a set of hands. Then came the fifth frame. Was him. Richard. And beside him, her. The same woman from the Polaroid. They were standing together in what looked unmistakably like our old studio. The corner lamp, the cracked stool, the canvas backdrop I'd painted myself. My studio. Our studio. He was smiling, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her hand rested on his shoulder. And worse, it wasn't a candid shot, it was posed. Someone had taken this picture for them. My throat closed up. For a long time, I just stared at the image, waiting for it to change, waiting for it to explain itself. It didn't. I set the film strip on the counter, reached for it, then hesitated. The rational part of me said to throw it away, burn it, destroy the evidence before it destroyed me. But something else, something sharper, kept my hand still. No, I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the small room. He deceived me with images. I'll answer him with the same. I turned off the red light and stood in the darkness, breathing in the chemical air. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable. For years, I told other people's stories through my lens: refugees, patients, survivors. I'd helped them reclaim their narratives, helped them see themselves as whole again. But somewhere along the line, I'd lost my own. That night, I decided to do what I'd spent a lifetime teaching others to do: tell the truth through the only language I trusted anymore: light. The next morning, I started planning what I would call my final exhibition. I even knew the title before the coffee finished brewing: Double Exposure. It fit too perfectly. A photograph made by exposing the film twice. Two images on the same frame, fighting for space, both real and both wrong. Just like my marriage. I wrote the concept in my notebook: a series of images revealing what happens when truth overlaps with illusion. I'd show the world who he really was, not by accusation, but by contrast. I would display our life side by side with the fragments of the other one, the photos, the letters, the pieces that didn't fit. I would let people see what it looks like when love becomes fabrication. The idea frightened me. Part of me still wanted to protect his memory, to protect the man I once believed he was. But another part, the one that had sat silently for too long, was finally awake. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the creak of rain gutters. I thought about all the times I'd framed a picture, adjusted the aperture, and told my students that exposure was everything. Too little, and you hide the truth. Too much, and you burn it. For 40 years, I'd been exposing everything except myself. When I closed my eyes, I could see it clearly. The exhibition space, the photos arranged like evidence, the Leica displayed in the center under a single beam of light. No captions, no explanations. Just truth, printed large enough that no one could look away. The thought made me feel something I hadn't felt in months, steady. Not happy, not even angry, just steady. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was clarity. I whispered into the dark. You built a life out of shadows, Richard. I'll show them the light that broke through. News of the exhibition spread faster than I expected. It started with a short post from a local gallery. Renowned photojournalist Eleanor Hayes returns with a new collection, Double Exposure. Within days, friends were calling, reporters were leaving messages, and the house phone wouldn't stop ringing. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt exposed. Then Daniel called. His voice on the other end of the line was tight, formal, the way people sound when they're trying to keep their anger polite. Mom, what are you doing? Putting my work together, I said. That's what photographers do. Don't play with me. I heard about this exhibition. They're saying you're turning Dad's memory into a spectacle. I didn't answer right away. I looked around the house. The stripped walls, the empty hooks where our photos used to hang. The air itself felt hollow. It's not a spectacle, I said finally. It's the truth. He sighed, a long, frustrated sound. Why can't you let it rest? He's gone. What good does it do to dig it up now? He can't defend himself. That word, defend, made something cold twist in my stomach. Daniel, I said softly, when he was alive, I stayed silent. I let him have the story. But now that he's gone, the story is mine. There was a pause. The kind of silence that feels like a wall between two people who used to understand each other. Then the line clicked. He'd hung up. After that call, the house went still again. No television, no music, just the hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping on the kitchen window. I sat at the dining table with a cup of cold tea, staring at the reflection in the glass. In the living room stood a tall mirror, one Richard had bought years ago from an antique shop in Portland. He'd liked it because of the carved oak frame. I'd liked it because it caught the afternoon light just right. Now, when I looked into it, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her shoulders were straighter. Her hair had gone whiter. Her eyes, my eyes, were sharper than I remembered. I leaned closer, studying the face that used to belong to someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's quiet support system. Let it free. But that woman was gone. What stood in her place was someone else. Someone who, for the first time in 40 years, wasn't carrying anyone's last name like armor. It was strange, realizing how much of myself I had lost by being part of someone else's frame. For decades, I was Richard's wife, Daniel's mother, the woman behind the camera. Now I was just Eleanor. And that, somehow, felt both terrifying and clean. The week before the opening, I noticed Daniel's name appear on my phone screen twice more. I didn't answer. I couldn't handle another conversation where love sounded like accusation. He left a voicemail once. Mom, please, don't do this. People will think you've lost your mind. Dad wouldn't want. He stopped mid-sentence. The message cut off there. I deleted it. Every day, I worked on the prints. I spent hours in the darkroom, watching the images appear, my hands moving by instinct. It was quiet there, and the smell of developer and fixer was oddly comforting. Some of the photos were old, our life before the lies. Some were new objects left behind, letters, shadows of the woman who'd walked into the funeral. Each print felt like peeling back a layer of silence I'd been living under. At night, I'd walk through the house, turning off lights one by one, the Leica hanging from my neck like a relic. Sometimes I'd stop in front of that mirror again, the one in the living room, and lift the camera toward my reflection. I'd frame the shot carefully, just me, nothing else. I never pressed the shutter. It was enough just to see myself through the viewfinder, clear and alone. One evening, as I was closing the blinds, I caught sight of my neighbor, Mrs. Graham, standing by her mailbox, pretending to sort letters while watching my house. Word was spreading faster than I could control. By now, I was the talk of the neighborhood, the widow with the scandalous exhibit, the woman airing her dead husband's secrets for art. Let them talk, I thought. Let them wonder. The truth had been buried long enough. That night, I sat again at the kitchen table, under the same dim light, with a single print in front of me. The image of Richard and that other woman, taken in my studio. The edges were still damp from the developer. I studied it until the lines of their faces stopped meaning anything. Until the photograph was just light and shadow, no emotion, no past. I whispered to the empty room, "You're not the only one who knows how to disappear, Richard." Then I slid the photo into a folder labeled Exhibit A. The house was silent. Outside, the rain had stopped. In the mirror across the room, I saw my reflection standing straighter than before. Calm, composed, unafraid. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. I was waiting for the storm I had already set in motion. The night of the opening, the gallery smelled of varnish and new paint, the scent of something freshly revealed. People filled the space slowly, murmuring in low, careful tones the way they do when they're unsure if it's art or confession they're about to witness. I stood near the back wall, watching them move from frame to frame. The series began with black and white photographs from my early years. Portraits of strangers, survivors, and quiet faces lit by mercy. Then the tone shifted. The last section, the one everyone had come to see, was titled Double Exposure. Each print showed two images superimposed, a memory and a betrayal, a truth and a lie. My wedding photo overlapped with the Polaroid from the funeral. Our home, my studio, merged with the fragments of the life Richard had built somewhere else. It wasn't revenge, it was anatomy, the dissection of a deception. As the room filled, I noticed the familiar shape of my son, Daniel, at the door. He wasn't alone. The woman beside him stopped me cold. Even across the crowd, I knew her face. I'd seen it in that cursed photograph. The other bride. Her name tag, hastily pinned to her coat, read Emma Clark. Daniel's jaw was tight, his eyes darting between me and the nearest camera crew. He hadn't warned me he was coming. He hadn't said a word since that last call. They walked straight toward me. The chatter softened, rippling into silence. Emma stopped about 2 feet away. Her hair was dark like in the photo, but shorter now, and her hands were trembling. Not from fear, I realized, but control. She looked at me with something that wasn't hate. Not exactly. More like sorrow that had grown teeth. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly, "I'm sorry to interrupt your event, but I think the truth belongs to more than one person." I stared at her, my heart pounding slow and deliberate. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photograph. When she unfolded it, I didn't need to look. I already knew. It was the photo. The same Polaroid but whole this time, not smudged by rain. Her mother stood beside Richard, smiling at something off camera. "I'm Emma," she said. "Richard Hayes was my father. And the woman in this picture, she was my mother. The real bride from that day." The crowd drew in a collective breath. The air thickened, as if everyone had forgotten how to move. My mouth went dry. My pulse thudded in my ears. I wanted to speak, but words were suddenly too heavy. Daniel stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Mom, I didn't know she was coming. I swear." He looked from me to Emma to the rows of faces waiting for someone to explain. Emma didn't back down. "He promised he would recognize us one day," she said. "But then he died. And all we have left is this. I didn't come to destroy anything. I just want a little bit of what's fair." The phrase, "a little bit of what's fair," hit something deep in me. For years, I'd told myself the same thing every time I compromised, every time I gave away another piece of myself to keep peace. Now that line came back, wearing someone else's voice. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. Then I said it. Calm, clear, deliberate. If fairness means a photograph cut in half, Emma, then I'm willing to share the frame. The room fell completely silent. Someone near the wall lowered their phone. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. Emma blinked, as if she hadn't expected gentleness. Daniel turned to me, disbelief written all over his face. Mom, what are you doing? I looked at him. Really looked. My son, caught between two versions of his father, two women holding pieces of the same truth. I'm finishing the story, I said. I walked over to the display table where my Leica rested under the spotlight. I picked it up. The metal felt cool, grounding. This camera has seen war zones, hospitals, graves, I said quietly, though my voice carried in the hush. It's captured people at their worst and still found something worth remembering. Tonight, it's going to do that again. I stepped toward Emma, holding the Leica at waist height. Stand with me, I told her. She hesitated, eyes wide. Then she nodded. We stood side by side, two women separated by history but joined by the same wound. I lifted the camera, adjusted the focus. The crowd seemed to fade away. Just the click of the shutter waiting between us. No, Richard, I said softly. Just us. She gave a tiny, broken smile. I pressed the shutter. Click. The sound echoed like a punctuation mark, clean and final. A flashbulb faded. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the whispers began. Sharp, slicing, hungry. Daniel's face was pale. He looked like someone who'd just watched his reflection shatter. Plum, how could you? He whispered. How could I what? I said, tell the truth? Or stop pretending the lies were noble? He shook his head, stepping back. You're humiliating us. I wanted to say, no, Daniel, I'm freeing us. But I let the silence answer instead. Emma turned toward me. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. He told me about you, she said. He said you were kind, that you'd understand. I do, I said. Too well. We stood there in front of everyone. Not rivals, not replacements. Just two women realizing they'd both been edited out of the same story. Someone in the back clapped. It was awkward, hesitant. Then another joined. Within moments, the room filled with uneven applause. Not for spectacle, but for survival. After the crowd dispersed, the gallery grew quiet again. The staff dimmed the lights. I stood in front of the last photo. The one I'd just taken, already printed from the instant Leica. There we were, two women holding a torn photograph between us. No man in the frame. No smiles forced for the camera. Just light and truth colliding. It wasn't beautiful, but it was real. Daniel had already left by then. Emma stayed behind, staring at the picture. I don't know what to do with this, she said softly. Neither do I replied. Maybe that's the point. Some truths don't fix anything. They just stop the bleeding. She nodded. We didn't say goodbye. She just walked out into the cold night, the sound of her heels fading against the pavement. I sat down on the gallery bench, exhausted. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but inside, something had gone still, like a lake after a storm. For years, I'd captured images trying to make sense of other people's chaos. Tonight, for the first time, I'd framed my own. The morning after the exhibition, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was Daniel. I reached for it half asleep, heart lifted for a second. Until I saw the screen. Hundreds of notifications, eminence, messages, tags. The internet had found me. At a first headline read, More photographer turns. Scorned widow. Eleanor Hayes's double exposure sparks outrage. The second was worse. Bitter wife or brave artist. Controversial show reveals husband's secret daughter. By noon, the hashtags were everywhere. Widow war, T double exposed, real bride. People I'd never met were debating my marriage like it was public property. One comment under a reposted photo said, "She's just jealous, she wasn't the pretty one." Another, "How dare she humiliate her son like that? Let the dead rest." I stopped reading after that, but the noise didn't stop. By evening, I heard from Daniel. Not through a call, but through a post. A photo of him and Emma outside the gallery, taken by a local journalist. The caption read, "Family divided over controversial art show." And underneath, his comment, "Some stories should stay private." That was all. No context. No defense. Just enough to make strangers pick a side. Yay. And, of course, they did. The calls from sponsors came next. First, the Arts Council. Polite, apologetic. "Mrs. Hayes, due to recent controversy, we're postponing your grant review until further notice." Then, the Association of Photojournalists. "Eleanor, we've admired your work for decades, but we can't have our name tied to personal disputes. You understand." I said nothing. They waited for me to protest, but there was nothing left to save. When they hung up, I looked around my studio and realized the silence was complete. Even the phone had stopped ringing. That night, I opened my laptop. There it was, a flood of articles, blogs, videos dissecting me like a crime scene. Someone had uploaded clips from the exhibition. You could hear the click of my Leica, the crowd's gasp, Emma's voice trembling as she said, "I'm his daughter." In slow motion, the internet turned that moment into a weapon. One clip zoomed in on my face. Cold, expressionless. A stranger wrote, "Look at her." No remorse, just pride. Thousands agreed. That's how public outrage works. It doesn't care about facts. It feeds on faces. I didn't leave the house for 3 days. The mail piled up. The coffee went stale. The mirror in the living room became my only witness. When I did look into it, I saw someone I barely recognized. Her eyes were red but steady. Her mouth no longer trembled. If grief had burned something away, what remained was iron. On the 4th day, I received an email. It was from Emma. "Eleanor, I didn't want any of this. I thought speaking up would bring closure, not chaos. The press twisted everything. Daniel's hurting. I'm sorry." At the bottom, "Please don't hate me." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I took a screenshot and saved it to a folder named Proof. Not out of spite, out of instinct. After a lifetime of framing truth, you learn to keep every exposure. The days that followed blurred into a strange, suspended time. Friends stopped visiting. The neighbors avoided eye contact when I stepped outside for mail. Someone left a note under my door. It said, in shaky handwriting, "Your husband was a good man. Shame on you." I crumpled it, dropped it in the trash, and took a picture before doing so. Daniel didn't call. When he finally texted, it was only 3 words. "Please stop, Mom." I typed back. "Stop what?" He didn't reply. I turned to work again. Not photography. Not yet. Instead, I began sorting through boxes, files, archives, the remnants of our shared life. Receipts from medical conferences, hotel keycards, letters tucked inside old books, written in handwriting that wasn't mine. Each discovery was like opening another shutter, another frame of a film I hadn't known was rolling. By then, I wasn't crying anymore. Tears felt too soft for what I'd become. What I felt instead was something colder, sharper, like focus returning after years of blur. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter. Termination of membership. American Photographers Association. The reason? Conduct detrimental to the integrity of the profession. I laughed when I read it. Integrity. As if truth had an expiration date. I printed the letter and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Next to it, I placed the screenshot of Emma's apology and Daniel's text. One by one, I began adding more. The hate comments, the articles, the photos. It looked like chaos, but to me it was a storyboard. The anatomy of a scandal, mapped out in ink and pixels. The last frame was empty. I didn't know yet what belonged there, but I knew it would come. One night, I dreamed of Richard. He was standing in our old studio, the Leica in his hands, smiling. He lifted it toward me, as if to take a picture. But when I looked into the lens, there was no reflection, only darkness. I woke up gasping. The clock read 3001 A. Rain again. Always rain. I went to the kitchen and brewed coffee, letting the hiss of the machine drown out the echo of his voice. On the table lay the torn Polaroid, mine, not hers. I'd kept it all this time, folded in half like a wound refusing to heal. I looked at it under the dim light, the water stains forming ghostly halos around their faces. For a moment, I felt nothing but exhaustion. Then, quietly, I reached for my camera. I took a picture of the photo itself. A photo of a lie, exposed by truth. Wasn't meant for art. It was documentation. My insurance against erasure. A few days later, the gallery director called. His voice was nervous, rehearsed. "Eleanor, the boards decided to close the exhibit early. Too much press. Too many threats." "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be." He hesitated. "You don't sound surprised." "Nothing surprises me anymore," I said, and hung up. I walked through the gallery that afternoon to collect my work. The walls looked bare again, like wounds stitched shut. Only one print remained, the photo of me and Emma holding the torn picture. I took it down, held it to the light. The image shimmered faintly, almost alive. For a moment, I imagined Richard looking at it, wherever he was. Would he recognize either of us now? Would he still say, "You're the only light I have left"? If he did, I would answer, "Light doesn't belong to anyone. It just moves on." When I returned home, I placed the photo on my desk beside the growing pile of evidence. The screen glowed with Emma's email, still open, her apology frozen in time. I took one last look at the folder labeled Proof. Then I created a new one, Exposure. It would be for what came next. I didn't know it yet, but the storm wasn't over. It was only reorganizing itself. Gathering strength in the dark corners of screens and whispers and family dinners I was no longer invited to. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had spent a lifetime being careful, polite, invisible. Now, every accusation, every article, every name they called me was just another flash of light, and I had learned how to work with light, even the kind that burns. A month passed before the next letter came. Thick cream paper, the kind lawyers use when they want to sound civil while gutting you. The envelope was stamped Hayes and Bloom, estate representation. For a second, I thought it was another formal apology about the exhibit's closure. It wasn't. Inside was a notice of transfer. Daniel Hayes and Emma Clark had filed joint papers to sell the old gallery property, the small downtown space that once held my exhibition. They'd listed it under the Richard Hayes estate. Attached was an itemized document of assets. Clinic holdings, stocks, photography equipment. Halfway down, I stopped reading. Leica collection. Belonging to Eleanor Hayes. Ownership unverified. For a moment, I just stared at the words. Ownership unverified. They were trying to sell my life's work as if it were an abandoned suitcase. The irony made me laugh. A small, sharp sound that startled even me. "So," I said aloud to the empty kitchen, "they think memory can be notarized." I read the letter again, slower this time. It was all there in the legal phrasing. The quiet betrayal, neatly formatted in 12-point font. Daniel's signature, black ink, steady. Emma's beside it, smaller, hesitant. It didn't matter how much I wanted to believe my son was being manipulated. His name was on the line. That was enough. For the next few days, I went through every file, every box in the house. I wasn't looking for revenge. Not yet. I was looking for proof. The kind of proof that couldn't be sold or rewritten. In the bottom drawer of Richard's old desk, under a stack of medical journals, I found a small envelope. No date. Just my husband's handwriting. E. Inside was a torn piece of paper, yellowed with time. Half of a letter written to someone else. The first lines were missing, but the ending remained intact. I loved her, but she never knew which her I meant. The words stopped me cold. I read them again and again, tracing the edges of the tear. The paper looked like it had been ripped in anger, the ink blotched as if water, or tears, had smeared it. He'd loved us both, apparently. Or maybe he'd loved no one at all. Just the illusion that he could be two men at once. Either way, That single surviving sentence was worth more than any inheritance. It was the truth, written in his own hand. And truth, unlike property, can't be divided. I sat at the desk for a long time, the torn letter lying between my palms like a fragile photograph. Outside, the afternoon light slanted across the room, catching dust in midair. It reminded me of a dark room, particles suspended, waiting to become something visible. That's when I knew what I had to do. They wanted to sell what was his. I would show them what was real. The auction was scheduled for early spring, a quiet event at a private gallery downtown. I wasn't invited, of course. The notice was purely for the record. But I knew enough people in the art world to make sure my presence would be impossible to ignore. I contacted Lucas, an old colleague who'd helped me in Bosnia years ago. He owed me a favor. When I told him what Daniel and Emma were planning, he sighed. "You're sure you want to go through with this?" "Yes," I said. "They're trying to sell ghosts. I just want to show them whose shadow they're standing in." He paused. "And if it gets ugly?" "It already is," I said, and hung up. For days, I prepared in silence. I printed enlargements of the torn letter, each piece blown up until the ink looked like veins on skin. At the bottom, I added one caption. "I loved her, but she never knew which her I meant." "Oh, Richard Hayes," undated. I placed the real letter, the fragile, torn half, in a glass case. Would be my exhibit, my rebuttal. No speeches, no accusations. Just handwriting. When I tested the layout in my studio, the room filled with afternoon light. It touched the glass, making the ink shimmer faintly. For a moment, I felt Richard's presence, not as a ghost, but as a man finally cornered by his own words. The night before the auction, Daniel texted for the first time in weeks. "Daniel, Mom, please don't come tomorrow." Me, "Why not?" Daniel, "Because it's over, let it go." Me, "It's not over until the truth is sold at its right price." He didn't reply. I left the phone on the counter, next to the Leica. The metal gleamed under the kitchen light, steady, patient. The same camera that had once captured our life together would now capture its end. The next morning, I dressed the way I used to before an assignment. Black jacket, hair pinned back, camera bag slung over my shoulder. A ritual steadied me. It reminded me who I was before I became someone's wife, someone's scandal. As I locked the door, I whispered under my breath, "You wanted to play curator, Daniel. Let's see how you handle an audience." I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger was loud, desperate, hungry for witness. What I felt was quieter, focus, precision, the same feeling before taking a difficult shot. Because this time, the subject wasn't a war zone or a stranger. It was my own family, and I intended to expose it properly. When I called Lucas, he answered on the second ring. His voice hadn't changed, still rough from years of cigarettes and field dust, still patient in that way only photographers who've seen too much can be. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, "I wondered when you'd decide to stop hiding." "I'm not hiding," I told him. "I'm composing." He laughed softly. "You always were the only person I knew who could make vengeance sound like art." We met the next afternoon at a small cafe near the river. The place hadn't changed in 30 years. Same chipped mugs, same smell of burnt espresso and rain. Lucas looked older, of course. We both did. But there was still that glint in his eyes, the one that noticed light before faces. He listened while I told him everything. Daniel, Emma, the sale, the letter. I watched his expression tighten, then soften again. When I finished, he stirred his coffee slowly and said, "Eleanor, you've spent your whole life chasing light. Maybe it's time you show people what lives in the shadow." I looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. "Then help me watch the morning, Lucas," I said. "Just enough so they can't pretend not to see." The plan came together the way all my best photos once had, through instinct and timing. Make it subtle, not a protest, not a spectacle. Just truth, projected large enough that no one could claim ignorance. I started building the slide presentation for the auction. It would begin innocently, a tribute reel, I told the organizers, to Richard's legacy. They agreed immediately, eager for something that looked respectable. But what I was really preparing was an exposure. In my studio, the walls were lined with prints. On one side, our real wedding photograph. Me in my rain-soaked veil, Richard beside me, smiling as if eternity had already begun. On the other, the fake one. His arm around the other bride, the same church steps, the same light. 2 frames taken in the same moment. 2 lives pretending to coexist. I scanned both images, layered them together, and projected them onto the wall. The overlap was uncanny. His smile matched, the angle identical. The only difference was the woman. In one, her hand gripped his. In the other, mine did. When I adjusted the opacity, both faces appeared at once, ghost-like, blurred together. It was the perfect metaphor for the man he'd been. Underneath, I typed the caption in white. 1 moment, 2 brides. Which one was real? I stared at the screen for a long time. Somewhere deep inside, I felt both the ache of love and the satisfaction of clarity, the strange duality of a woman who could finally see, even if what she saw hurt. Lucas stopped by to help me test the equipment. He stood behind me as the images flickered across the studio wall, his voice low. "You know, you're going to start a war. Then let it be a clean one," I said. "And if your son turns against you completely?" "He already has," I answered. "This isn't about him anymore." He nodded. "Then make sure the light's steady. If you're going to expose a ghost, you don't want the flash to fail." For the next week I rehearsed the timing. Each slide would fade into the next with quiet precision, no narration, no theatrics. The audience would think they were watching a retrospective of Richard's life, until the final image appeared. The torn letter, enlarged, projected across the gallery wall. I loved her, but she never knew which her I meant. That would be the last line. His own handwriting, his own confession. No need for commentary. The truth would speak in his ink. I was meticulous about every detail. I tested the projector brightness, adjusted the contrast of each image until the exposure was perfect. Lucas teased me about it. "You're treating this like it's a front-page spread." "It is," I said, "just not for the paper." He raised his coffee mug. "To precision, then, and to women who aim steady." At night, I wrote notes in my journal, refining what I'd say if I had to speak, though I wasn't sure I would. The entries became a strange mixture of confession and strategy. Do not flinch when Daniel looks at you. Letter. Do not let pity sound like forgiveness. Somewhere on the last page I wrote, "Truth has weight. The only way to carry it is to stop apologizing for the noise it makes when it hits the floor." 3 days before the auction, I received an email from the organizers confirming my attendance as consultant. Daniel's name was listed as co-executor of the estate, Emma's as representative for contingent interest. My title, former spouse. I laughed when I read that. Former spouse. As if marriage could be dissolved by paperwork and a coffin. That night, I dreamed of light again. Not the cold white of camera flashes, but the kind that seeps through cracks. Soft, forgiving, uninvited. In the dream, I was back in my old darkroom, watching 2 images overlap in the developing tray. They refused to separate, no matter how long I washed them. Then, slowly, one began to fade. Not mine. When I woke, dawn was creeping through the blinds, thin as tracing paper. I decided I'd sleep only after the auction. After the last projection. The morning before the event, Lucas arrived with his old field camera slung over his shoulder. "Annie," he asked. "I've been ready for 40 years, I said. He smiled, studying me for a moment. "You look like yourself again, Ellie. The one from Sarajevo, the woman who didn't blink when the bombs fell." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I just finally stopped looking through someone else's lens." We spent the day packing, projectors, slides, the framed letter sealed in glass. Every click of a latch, every zipper, every coiled cable felt ritualistic, like loading ammunition. Before we left, I walked through my house one last time. The empty picture hooks, the quiet rooms, the mirror catching my reflection. I paused there and whispered to it, to the woman staring back. "This is the last time you stand in anyone's shadow." Then I picked up the Leica, slung it over my shoulder, and followed Lucas out into the rain. The streets of Portland were slick, reflecting the gray sky. Lucas drove, one hand on the wheel, the other drumming against the dashboard to some rhythm only he could hear. Ew. Neither of us spoke. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of people who've already decided what has to be done. When we reached the gallery, the staff were setting up rows of chairs, hanging banners with Richard's name. I saw Daniel across the room, giving instructions. He didn't notice me, or pretended not to. Emma stood beside him, looking pale, uncertain. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for them both. Then I remembered the letter, the line that split us all apart, and the pity vanished. That evening, when the guests began to arrive, I stood near the back with Lucas, watching the lights dim. The projector flickered to life, and the first image appeared. Richard's portrait, smiling, alive, perfect. The audience murmured approvingly. They had no idea what was coming. I glanced at Lucas. He nodded once. The next slide began to fade in, our wedding photo. Then, layered over it, the other wedding photo. The same man. 2 brides. Perfect alignment. And below, the caption I'd written, "One moment, 2 brides." Which one was real? Gasps rippled through the room. The truth, finally, was developing. The room was already half sold before anyone lifted a paddle. Rows of chairs faced a long table where 2 lawyers sat with neat stacks of paper and pens lined like scalpels. Later, the banner above read, "The Richard Hayes Estate. Auction." Serif font, tasteful, clinical. On the far wall, they'd placed a velvet-draped plinth for the featured lots. One of them was mine in name, if not in law, like a collection. A small placard beneath it said, "Ownership under review." I stood behind the last row, Lucas at my shoulder, the projector case by my feet. The room smelled like polished wood and paper expensive neutrality. People spoke in soft, polite voices that made me think of hospitals. I recognized a few faces. A museum curator, 2 former donors from the clinic, an editor who hadn't returned my emails in a decade. Daniel moved like he belonged at the center of things. He wore Richard's old cufflinks, the ones shaped like small lens apertures. It should have been touching. Instead, it felt like a prop. Emma stood a little behind him, pale, trying to fold herself into a quiet corner. When our eyes met, she looked away first. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us." His voice had the warm varnish of someone who could sell you the same item twice. "We'll begin with administrative formalities. Co-executor Daniel Hayes." Daniel took the pen. His hand hovered over the contract. I leaned down to the power strip at the base of the wall and pressed my thumb to the switch. The gallery lights dimmed as the projector bloomed awake, color bleeding onto the wall like dawn. A few heads turned. The auctioneer blinked. One of the lawyers frowned. Pusis exhale. On the screen, 2 photographs side by side. Our wedding. Me, rain-soaked bouquet askew. Their wedding. That wasn't mine. The other bride, same archway, same light. The room went still in a way that felt physical, like a pressure drop before a storm. I walked down the aisle slowly, my shoes making a soft sound on the wood, and took the small rise beside the legal table. No microphone. I didn't need one. "If anyone would like to purchase these memories," I said, voice even, "please be prepared to pay for the pain that comes with them." Silence. Then a rustle. Then the kind of collective breath people draw when something is either about to break or heal. Emma made a choking sound and covered her mouth. Daniel's pen scratched a meaningless arc across the signature line. He tossed it. It skittered across the table and fell to the floor. His lawyer stooped, embarrassed, and didn't pick it up. I nodded toward the screen. 2 photographs, 1 man, 1 hour, 2 vows. You can appraise a lens and assign a value to glass and brass. But this? I gestured gently. This isn't an object. It's a double exposure of a lie. No one moved. Even the auctioneer seemed unsure whether to ask security to cut the feed or keep still and let the air decide. I clicked to the next slide. The torn letter filled the wall, ink thickened by magnification until it looked like veins. There was a small intake of breath near the front. The curator pressed her hand to her chest. I read only the end, because that was all there was. I loved her, but she never knew which her I meant. A whisper of chairs. Someone muttered, "Jesus Christ." Someone else said, "Is that his handwriting?" The editor I recognized leaned forward, hungry. Daniel stood. His face was the exact white of the projection. "Mom, turn it off." I met his eyes. For a second, I saw him at 7, asleep in the back seat after a long drive, trusting me to get him home. Then, the second was over. "I'm not here to sell your father," I said quietly. "I'm here to stop you selling me." Emma stepped forward, voice thin. "She's not wrong." Daniel rounded on her. "Don't." Emma didn't look at him. She looked at me. "He promised he would claim us. He wrote to my mother and said he loved her. He also wrote to you, I'm sure, and said the same. I don't want his money anymore. I wanted the truth." She swallowed. Suppose this is it." I clicked again. The slide changed to my prepared caption, "Straubers. One moment, 2 brides. Which one was real?" My throat felt steady. The steadiness surprised me. "I don't need the house," I said, turning to the audience. "Keep it. I won't contest the sale. But I'm keeping the light that came through those windows, because that's the part no one can take." I let the words settle, then gave them the line I had written for myself and been afraid to speak until I heard my own voice shape it. "I'm no longer anyone's wife. I'm no longer anyone's mother. I am the woman who photographs the truth." The sentence sounded colder than I meant. It wasn't disowning Daniel so much as disinheriting the role that had been used to control me. Still, the line drew a low, shocked murmur. The auctioneer stepped forward, palms up. "Mrs. Hayes, perhaps we can proceed?" I offered. "By all means." I nodded to the lawyers. "But first, correct your inventory. The Leica collection is not ownership unverified. It is the work of my hands and my eye. You can litigate property, gentlemen. You cannot notarize memory." One lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes, the estate's appraisers, never asked me," I said. "Ask me now," he faltered, as if his script had run out. From the back, Lucas said a single word, softly, "Light." I clicked again. The final slide. A simple white frame on black that read, "Exhibit A." Inside the frame, a slow crossfade, my studio corner, then theirs in the exact same corner. My stool, my lamp, my backdrop. I had aligned them so precisely that the overlap was a confession. A few people gasped as the shadows matched. I didn't narrate. I let the picture tell on him. Daniel whispered, "Stop." It wasn't a command anymore. It sounded like a plea he didn't know where to send. I lowered my hand from the remote. The image froze on the letter again, the last line holding steady on their faces like a verdict. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, the curator in the second row stood. "As a matter of professional interest," she said carefully, "I advise the board to suspend the sale of any materials labeled Leica Collection pending verification of creator and chain of custody." The lawyer on the left bristled. "This is irregular." The curator's voice sharpened. "So is auctioning a woman's archive under her husband's name." Scattered applause. Not much. Enough. Emma was crying openly now. She didn't hide. She didn't apologize. She just let it happen, which felt, for once, like the only honest thing in the room besides the giant sentence on the wall. Daniel sank into his chair. He looked 15, not 35. He looked like a boy who tried to pick up something too heavy without checking what it was first. I felt the part of me that would always be his mother reach for him. I let that part stop just short of touching. Love and clarity can exist in the same body, they just don't hold hands in public. The auctioneer conferred with the lawyers in quick mutters. Then he returned to the mic. "We will take a brief recess." No one moved. The room had the stillness of a photograph. I stepped down from the riser. People made space. A man in a navy suit said, "Mrs. Hayes," that was, and didn't finish his sentence. Another woman squeezed my arm. "You saved me years," she said, and moved away before I could ask what she meant. Emma approached. Up close, she looked so much like a version of myself I didn't become that I had to fight the urge to tell her to eat, to sleep, to leave town for a week. "Thank you," she said, voice small but intact. "For making him choose, even if it's too late." "He chose a long time ago," I said gently. "We just chose to see it today." She nodded. "I won't sign anything," she whispered. "Not like this." "That's your decision," I said. "Make it for yourself, not against him." She looked startled, then relieved. She squeezed my hand and stepped away. Daniel didn't come to me. He stared at the letter as if it might blink. When he finally stood, the chair legs scraped loudly. The first ugly sound of the evening. He walked past me without a word. I let him go because right now there was nothing I could give him but a door that would stay unlocked. Lucas touched my elbow. "Do you want me to kill the projector?" "Leave it," I said. "Let the sentence do what sentences do." He smiled a little. "You always were better at endings than the rest of us." I didn't feel like I'd ended anything. It felt like I'd finally stopped collaborating. The lawyers returned. One cleared his throat, the universal sign for a pivot. Given the new information, the estate will postpone the disposition of photographic materials until questions of authorship and ownership are resolved. There. Language finding its manners again. I almost thanked them for their euphemism. "As for the property," he continued, "we will proceed with the sale of the real estate only." I nodded. "I told you. I don't need the house." I looked up at the projection one more time. The letters large enough to touch. I loved her, but she never knew which her I meant. There were two hers in the sentence. Three, if you counted the woman who wrote the caption now stamped into the room's silence. The sentence didn't answer which of us he loved. It only admitted that he kept the ambiguity for himself. That was the point, and the problem. Ambiguity is a kind of theft when only one person gets to use it. I picked up the Leica from the plinth. No one stopped me. I put its strap over my shoulder the way I had on the best and worst days of my life, and for the first time in months the weight felt exactly right. On my way out, I turned back to the room. The buyers, the critics, the ghosts of expectation. I could have given them a speech about art and truth and women aging out of their usefulness and refusing to go quietly. Instead, I gave them what we'd all come for. "If anyone would like to make an offer," I said, "bid on this." The cost of looking away, play what it owes you, then leave what isn't yours. No one laughed. Good. It wasn't a joke. I stepped through the double doors into the hallway. The quieter air felt like a dignity I'd forgotten I could have. Lucas fell into step beside me. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you're shaking." "I'm steady," I said. It was true. The tremor in my hands was the kind that happens after a long exposure, nerve and relief and a little bit of life returning. We walked out into evening. It wasn't raining. The sky over Portland was a pale, even gray, like the inside of a studio softbox, a light that no one owns. Behind us, through the gallery window, the words still glowed on the wall, calm as a law. I looked back again. When I got home that night, the house didn't look like mine anymore. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled of wet earth and camellias from the garden. I left my coat on the chair, dropped the keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, and stood there for a moment, waiting for the silence to settle. It came slowly, first as a hum, then as a kind of peace. On the table sat the Leica, exactly where I'd placed it the morning of the auction. The strap coiled beside it like a sleeping animal. For years, I'd treated that camera as an extension of my eyes, my hands, my memory. Tonight, it felt like the only thing left that didn't need explaining. I brushed my fingers along the metal body. The lens was cool, still faintly smudged from my fingerprints. Outside, the dawn was beginning. That pale Portland light that creeps in without announcement. I walked to the window and opened it. The hinges groaned softly, like the house itself was exhaling. A single sunbeam slid across the floorboards, touched the corner of the mirror in the living room, and bounced back toward me. For a moment, I saw my own reflection doubled, the woman I used to be, and the one standing here now, older, freer, not afraid of the shadow behind her. It struck me then how simple freedom looked. No applause, no grand ending. Just a quiet room, a bit of sunlight, and the sound of my own breathing. I picked up the Leica and turned it toward the mirror. My reflection met the lens, steady, unflinching. I adjusted the focus manually, the way I used to do in the field. The old muscle memory came back like a heartbeat. Click. The shutter's sound filled the room. The echo lingered, softer than I remembered, but final in its own way. That photograph, my face in morning light, alone, unhidden, would be the last one I ever took of myself. Just Tange, not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, just as Eleanor. I left the camera on the table and made coffee. The smell rose warm and earthy, wrapping around the quiet. On the fridge, a single magnet held a yellowed photo, me and Richard on our first trip to the coast. I didn't take it down. It no longer hurt to see it. It was just a picture. Evidence of a time that existed, then ended. The pain, I realized, wasn't in the image. It was in the pretending. Now that the pretending was over, even the ghosts looked softer. By mid-morning, the phone started ringing again. Reporters, colleagues, old friends who hadn't called in years. I let it ring. There was nothing left to explain. People always want statements after a storm, but storms don't issue press releases. They just leave the air cleaner. I took my coffee to the back porch and sat there, watching the neighborhood wake up. Children on bicycles, a man walking his dog, the mail truck grinding down the street. Ordinary life, the kind I used to photograph to remind others of their own peace. I realized I didn't want to capture it anymore. I just wanted to live in it. At some point, I went back inside and printed the photograph I'd taken that morning. The process felt sacred again. The chemicals, the slow reveal. In the red glow of the darkroom light, the image emerged, my face framed by the mirror, sunlight cutting across the cheekbones, eyes open. No performance, no posing, just truth, in grayscale. I pinned it to the wall above my desk, the same spot where Richard's letter had once hung. Below it, I wrote with a fine black marker, "Final exposure." It didn't feel like revenge anymore, like restoration. That afternoon, I boxed up the old negatives. Decades of work, from war zones to weddings. I labeled each carefully, then sealed the boxes with thick tape. They would go to the university archive, not the estate. I'd already made the call. The curator had said yes. Let the students study what I saw, not what they said about me. When the tape smoothed flat under my hand, I felt a strange lightness. For 40 years, my life had been divided into frames, cropped, adjusted, edited to fit someone else's comfort. Now, I had nothing left to crop. As the sun began to lower, I stood by the open window again. The same beam that had entered in the morning now retreated slowly across the room, climbing the opposite wall like a quiet farewell. Dust floated in its path, glowing for a second before disappearing. I raised my hand, letting the light fall across my palm. It was warm, alive, moving, impossible to hold but easy to feel. I thought of Richard's last words, the letter, the confusion of love and lies. I thought of Daniel, wherever he was, sorting through whatever remained of his father's estate. And I thought of Emma, the woman in the other photograph, walking somewhere under the same light. For the first time, I wished them peace, not out of forgiveness, but out of release. The story was no longer ours to carry. I took one last look at the photograph on the wall. Me, smiling just enough to be real. Not the smile of triumph or revenge, but of someone who had finally come out of the darkroom and found that daylight didn't burn. I whispered to it quietly, or developed now. No more negatives left. Then I turned off the lights, closed the window, and let the house rest. Outside, the last of the sunlight slid away, leaving only a soft, even gray, the kind of light every photographer waits for. And for the first time in my life, I didn't reach for the camera. A went down to the table, turned off the light, and left the door open to let the light in. The camera is already rolling when I sit down. No studio, no backdrop. Just the window behind me and the sound of the ocean outside. Light spills across the floor, catching on the edge of the cracked mirror behind me. I take a slow breath, then look straight into the lens. If one day, I begin, you discover that your wedding photograph was only a composite, a frame someone built to make the lie look whole, don't erase it. I pause, letting the words settle. Somewhere outside, a gull calls, long and distant. Don't tear it, don't burn it. Take another picture instead. One where you're standing alone, but standing as yourself. No pretending, no posing, no borrowed light. Just you, as you are, still here. For a moment, I can see my reflection faintly in the camera lens. Older, yes, but clear. I've spent my whole life chasing focus, and only now do I realize what it means to truly see. I lean forward slightly. My voice softens. Share this story, I say. Not for me. For someone else out there who's still afraid to look at her own reflection. Let her know that even inside a betrayed memory, there's always a shard of light that never lied to her. I think of all the women who came to my class, the ones who brought boxes of photographs and pieces of their own silence. I think of the moment each of them realized they didn't have to crop their lives to fit anyone else's frame. That's what this is really about. Not revenge, not art, but recovery. The slow, patient kind that begins when you decide your story is still worth telling. The light shifts through the window. It hits the mirror, scattering across the wall, breaking into small golden fragments. I smile. Every photograph is a proof of life, I say quietly, even the ones that hurt. Especially those. I glance down at the Leica resting beside me. The same camera that once captured lies, now idle in the sunlight, as if it knows its work is done. Then I look back into the lens, the way I've done all my life, and give the ending I've rehearsed only once, in my head. But maybe, just maybe. This is the first photograph ever taken with free light. The camera clicks softly, fade to white,